The Forgotten Patch of Alaska. Doug Muchler had always considered himself a practical man. He grew up in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, where the biggest mystery he'd ever faced was figuring out how to fix the family's broken lawnmower. But life is a way of steering you into the unexpected, and by September 1989, Doug found himself standing in a dimly lit map room at Fort Richardson, just outside of Anchorage, Alaska, with a new assignment that promised to be anything but ordinary. Doug was no rookie. He was a counterintelligence officer with years of experience under his belt, tasked with investigating espionage and terrorism for the U.S. military. It was serious work, the kind of work that left little room for imagination or wild theories. Alaska, however, was already proving to be a different beast. Nearly 700,000 square miles of rugged mountains, icy tundra, and remote wilderness stretched before him, twice the size of Texas. It was a lot of ground to cover, and Doug knew he had to get his bearings fast. That's why his first stop was the map room to study the lay of the land. The map room at Fort Richardson was exactly what you'd expect from a military base. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over the massive wooden table that dominated the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, stuffed with rolled-up maps, old reports, and weathered binders. Doug spread out a large map of Alaska across the table and leaned over it, tracing his finger along the jagged lines of the mountain ranges and rivers. Denali stood out immediately. Mount McKinley, as it was still known to many, was the tallest peak in North America, towering at 20,310 feet. Doug made a mental note of it, thinking he'd need to understand the terrain better if he was going to do his job effectively. He was methodical, working his way across the map from east to west, cataloging cities, rivers, and old mining towns. It was standard stuff, nothing unusual, until his eyes settled on something that made him stop cold. In the middle of Denali National Park, about 60 miles west of Mount McKinley, was a small, featureless patch on the map. It was no larger than his thumbprint, shaded a faint white. At first, Doug thought it was a printing error. He leaned in closer, squinting under the harsh lights. But then he saw the small, crisp label stamped beside it. "This area not surveyed to date." Doug frowned. That didn't make any sense. Alaska was one of the most heavily mapped and surveyed regions in the world, especially by the military. Every inch of the state had been cataloged and recorded, or so he thought. Why would there be a small patch in the middle of Denali National Park that hadn't been surveyed? Doug wasn't prone to paranoia, but his training had taught him that when something didn't add up, you didn't ignore it. He pulled out a magnifying glass from the desk drawer and held it over the spot, scanning for any sign of topography, rivers, valleys, peaks, but there was nothing. It was completely blank. He sat back and rubbed his chin. Maybe it was just a bureaucratic oversight, an error in the survey records. But a nagging feeling at the back of his mind wouldn't let it go. Doug had learned to trust his instincts. They had kept him alive more than once during his time in the service. Still, he knew better than to push too hard. He was a warrant officer, not some conspiracy theorist chasing shadows. If the military wanted him to know what was out there, they would have told him. But as the days passed, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His thoughts kept drifting back to that blank patch on the map. It didn't help that Fort Richardson was the kind of place where rumors spread fast, but never gained traction. Over beers at the officers' club, he heard whispers about strange lights over the Alaskan wilderness, about entire platoons being reassigned overnight after exercises near Denali. Most of it was chalked up to the extreme weather or the isolating effects of the long, dark winters. But Doug couldn't stop thinking about that white patch. What was out there, and why didn't the military want anyone to know about it? Then there was the way his superior officer reacted when Doug casually mentioned the map anomaly during a briefing. Colonel Harris had been leaning over his desk, signing off on a stack of papers. But when Doug mentioned the not surveyed label, Harris's pen froze mid-stroke. His eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced up at Doug. "Don't worry about it, Warrant Officer," Harris said. His tone clipped. "It's nothing." Doug knew better than to press. But Harris's reaction said more than enough. This wasn't a printing error. This wasn't some oversight. Someone knew exactly what was out there, and they didn't want anyone asking questions. That night, Doug lay awake in his bunk, the steady hum of the heating unit in the background. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an abandoned military installation? A missile silo? Or something else entirely? He'd heard stories, the kind of stories you laughed off because they didn't fit into the tidy framework of military protocol. Stories about underground bases, strange aircraft, even things that didn't belong on this planet. Doug wasn't the type to believe in that kind of thing. He dealt in hard facts and intelligence briefings, not sci-fi fantasies. But that white patch on the map, it didn't fit into any logical framework he could piece together. And that, more than anything, is what bothered him the most. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep, but not before making a quiet decision. If the military didn't want him to know what was out there, maybe it was time he started finding out for himself. The mysterious disappearance of the underground pyramid report. It was late in 1992, a cold Alaskan night, when Doug Muchler found himself sitting with a group of off-duty soldiers in the recreation hall at Fort Richardson. The TV in the corner buzzed with the evening news, mostly covering the usual local stories about weather and minor events around Anchorage. But suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The anchor on the screen reported something shocking: a powerful underground nuclear test conducted by China had sent shockwaves rippling through the Earth's crust, all the way to Alaska. That alone would have been remarkable enough. But what followed was what truly made Doug's blood run cold. The seismologists who analyzed the data from the shockwaves discovered a massive structure beneath the Alaskan wilderness, a pyramid. And not just any pyramid, it was larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing at an astonishing 550 feet tall, with its base located about 700 feet below the surface. The broadcast even showed a map pinpointing the location right in the middle of a section of Denali National Park that Doug distinctly remembered seeing marked on a military map as "this area not surveyed to date." His mind immediately flashed back to that moment in the map room. Years earlier, when he first noticed that strange patch of land, Doug sat up straighter, his mind racing. The news anchor was saying that the pyramid was an anomaly, something not naturally formed. The materials didn't match the surrounding geology, and the geometric precision of the structure was impossible to ignore. What was a massive, precisely engineered pyramid doing buried beneath the Alaskan wilderness? Doug exchanged nervous glances with the other soldiers in the room. They were all thinking the same thing. This was huge. As soon as the news segment ended, Doug rushed back to his quarters. He scrambled to set up his VCR, making sure it was ready to record the 11 p.m. news. If the story was true, it would certainly be mentioned again in the next broadcast. Doug's heart pounded as the clock approached 11. He sat in front of the TV, waiting. But when the news came on, there was nothing. No mention of the Chinese nuclear test. No mention of the pyramid. It was as if the story had never happened. Confused, Doug called a few of his contacts, fellow soldiers who are known to follow the news closely. None of them had heard anything about the pyramid. One soldier who had been sitting in the recreation hall with Doug even started to doubt his own memory, saying maybe he had misheard or imagined it. But Doug knew what he saw. He knew they had all seen it. Someone had erased the story. The next day, Doug used his military intelligence credentials to visit the local news station. He asked to speak to the station manager. The manager, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor, greeted Doug with a polite but cautious smile. Doug mentioned the story about the pyramid and asked why it hadn't been aired again. The manager's expression immediately darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about," the manager said. Doug pressed him. He even described the segment in detail: the map, the analysis from the seismologists, the comparison to the Great Pyramid of Giza. The manager shook his head and insisted that no such story had ever aired. Doug was about to give up and leave when a young employee standing near the back of the room made eye contact with him. The kid looked pale and nervous. He gestured for Doug to step aside. Doug followed him to a quiet corner of the room. The young man's eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in and whispered, "Look, I could get fired for telling you this, but you're not crazy. We aired the story. I saw it with my own eyes." Doug's pulse quickened. "What happened?" he asked. The young man swallowed hard. "A couple of guys in suits showed up about 2 hours after the broadcast. They went straight into the station manager's office and closed the door. About 20 minutes later, the manager comes out looking like he's seen a ghost. The next thing I know, they're erasing the story from the archive. They even took the tapes." Doug frowned. "Did they say why?" The young man hesitated. "They said it was a matter of national security. The nuclear test. The pyramid. We were told to forget about it or face criminal charges." Doug's mind raced. He had worked in military intelligence long enough to recognize a cover-up when he saw one. Whoever those men were, they had the authority to erase a televised news story and the power to make sure it stayed erased. He thanked the young man for his honesty and promised to keep his identity secret. Doug left the station more disturbed than when he arrived. He had always believed that the government kept certain information classified for national security reasons. But this was different. This wasn't about classified weapons or military technology. This was about something ancient, buried deep beneath the Alaskan wilderness, something so important that someone was willing to erase all traces of it from public record. That night, Doug gathered some of his fellow soldiers, the same ones who had watched the original news broadcast. He told them what he had learned at the news station. At first, they were skeptical. But when Doug mentioned the men in suits and the confiscation of the tapes, they knew it had to be true. "They want us to forget," one soldier said. "But why?" Another asked. Doug shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" From that point on, Doug became obsessed with uncovering the truth about the underground pyramid. But every lead he followed seemed to disappear into thin air. Military records were classified. The news station denied any record of the story. Even the soldiers who had watched the original broadcast started to question their own memory. Years later, when Doug was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, home of the NSA, he would attempt to dig deeper into the mystery. But the deeper he dug, the more resistance he faced. Someone wanted to keep the secret buried, and Doug was starting to realize why. This wasn't just about a hidden structure. This was about power, ancient power, and whoever controlled it didn't want the world to know it even existed. The mysterious Black Pyramid of Alaska, a tale of hidden secrets. In the early 1990s, Doug Muchler was no ordinary military officer. He was a chief warrant officer in military intelligence, stationed at Fort Richardson near Anchorage, Alaska. Doug's work focused on counterintelligence, rooting out espionage and terrorist threats, so he was no stranger to secrecy or high-stakes operations. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would stumble upon in the depths of a government archive years later, a discovery so shocking that even seasoned intelligence officers were forced to intervene. It all started with a map. Doug arrived at Fort Richardson in September 1989, fresh from Ohio, and eager to familiarize himself with Alaska's rugged terrain. Alaska, with its vast wilderness and sprawling 663,300 square miles of mountains, lakes, and tundra, was twice the size of Texas. Understanding the lay of the land was crucial for his job. One afternoon, while studying a series of topographical maps in the base's map room, Doug noticed something strange. On a detailed map of Denali National Park, there was a small blanked-out section about the size of his thumb, a white patch roughly 60 miles west of Mount McKinley, now Denali. It was labeled with the cryptic note, "This area not surveyed to date." Doug thought it was odd. Every inch of Alaska had been surveyed and mapped by the military and geological agencies over the decades. Why would such a small patch of land, in the middle of a national park, no less, remain unmapped? He made a note of it, but at the time, he had more pressing duties. As an experienced intelligence officer, he knew better than to pry into something that wasn't immediately relevant to his mission. Still, the image of that blank spot lingered in his mind. 3 years later, in 1992, Doug was transferred to Fort Meade in Maryland, home to the National Security Agency, NSA. Fort Meade was more than just another military base. It housed a vast warehouse of government records, an archive so massive that it spanned multiple floors and contained row after row of classified documents, some dating back to the early 20th century. Doug wasn't working directly for the NSA, at least. That's what he would say, but his role gave him access to the archive. Doug was naturally curious. One day, with some free time on his hands, he decided to test his luck. He approached the archivist and casually asked about archaeological sites in Alaska. He avoided mentioning the word pyramid or referencing the mysterious blank spot on the map. The archivist didn't hesitate. He scribbled down a series of catalog numbers on a slip of paper and handed it to Doug. The numbers led him to a section deep in the archive, where stacks of dusty manila folders and boxes lined the metal shelves. Doug retrieved the files marked Alaska and settled into a reading room. He flipped through documents detailing mining operations, geological surveys, and Native Alaskan settlements' standard fare. But then he found something unusual. A series of reports referenced an underground structure west of Mount Denali. The language was vague, but it hinted at a discovery during the 1950s, a large, unnatural formation buried deep beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Before Doug could dive deeper, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see 2 men standing over him, tall, dressed in dark suits. Their expressions were stone cold. "You don't have a need to know," one of the men said. Doug frowned. "I'm just looking at archaeological reports," he replied. "We know what you're looking for," the second man said, his tone sharp. "You need to leave the building immediately." Doug was no rookie. He had dealt with intimidation tactics before. But this was different. These men weren't regular security personnel. Their suits were too sharp, their manner too polished. Doug's instincts told him these were not just bureaucrats, these were intelligence operatives. Doug hesitated. "What's in Alaska?" The first man's eyes narrowed. "They don't want us interfering up there anymore," Doug tensed. "They? Who's they?" No answer. The men simply stared at him until Doug stood, collected the files, and handed them over. Without another word, they escorted him to the exit. Doug knew better than to push his luck. He had no formal authority in Fort Meade and was technically off duty when he requested the files. He walked out of the archive, heart pounding. His years of experience in military intelligence taught him that when someone tells you to stop digging, especially in that tone, it means you've hit on something important. That night, Doug sat in his quarters, running through the day's events in his mind. What was so dangerous about an underground structure in Alaska that it required direct intervention from intelligence agents? What did they mean by they? He had seen enough in his career to suspect that this wasn't about national security in the usual sense. This was about something far older, far deeper. Doug shared his experience with some trusted colleagues. They were just as puzzled as he was. One of them, a veteran intelligence analyst, suggested that Doug might have stumbled upon something connected to Cold War-era operations, perhaps an abandoned missile silo or a nuclear testing site. But Doug wasn't convinced. This didn't feel like a Cold War cover-up. This felt ancient. Doug's experience at Fort Meade left him with more questions than answers. Over the years, he would continue to seek the truth about the Black Pyramid of Alaska. He shared his story with others, fellow soldiers, journalists, and researchers. Many brushed it off as a wild conspiracy theory. But Doug knew what he had seen, and more importantly, he knew how quickly the government had moved to shut him down. Years later, when Doug finally went public with his story, others came forward with their own accounts. Pilots, engineers, and even native Alaskans described strange encounters near Mount Denali, electromagnetic disturbances, unexplained military activity, and sightings of unusual structures. Doug's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger mystery, one that someone, somewhere, was determined to keep hidden. Doug Muchler's encounter at Fort Meade wasn't just about a forbidden file or a government cover-up. It was a glimpse into a deeper truth, a mystery buried beneath the frozen wilderness of Alaska, guarded by forces that defied explanation. Doug never found the answers he sought, but his story remains a chilling reminder that some secrets are meant to stay buried. The mysterious testimony of Marty Johnson and Lee Pearson. Marty Johnson had always been a man of precision. He was a Navy engineer during World War II, known for his steady hands and sharp mind. After the war, Marty was recruited by Western Electric Manufacturing, which later became part of Bell Labs. It was the kind of job that suited Marty perfectly, working on cutting-edge technology, tinkering with the mysterious and the complex. By the late 1950s, Marty had become a master of electrical engineering, particularly with the new and revolutionary transistor technology. He didn't know where Bell Labs had gotten the idea for transistors, but he suspected it was from something or someone far beyond human understanding. It was in 1959 when Marty received the most unusual assignment of his career. He was flown from Omaha, Nebraska, to Unalakleet, Alaska. Marty had never heard of the place before, and frankly, it didn't matter. He was just excited to be working on another top-secret military project. The secrecy, the classified nature of the work, it all made him feel like a character in a spy novel. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. Upon landing in Unalakleet, Marty and several other engineers were loaded onto a white bus with blacked-out windows. The bus ride was rough, lasting over 6 hours, winding through rugged Alaskan terrain. Marty couldn't see where they were going, but he could feel the cold pressing against the thin metal walls of the bus. When they finally stopped, the door opened to a blast of freezing air. Stepping outside, Marty was surrounded by a landscape of snow and ice, with jagged mountains looming in the distance. It looked like the edge of the world. 2 uniformed officers stood beside what appeared to be a concrete shed in the middle of nowhere. The group of engineers shuffled toward it, seeking shelter from the biting wind. Once inside, Marty noticed the shed was unusually reinforced, with thick steel beams and a heavy metal gate. An officer pulled the gate closed behind them and pressed a button on the wall. With a mechanical groan, the floor beneath them began to descend. It was an elevator, a very large one. Marty's engineering instincts kicked in. The mechanics were far too sophisticated for a simple supply depot. This was something else. The elevator descended for a long time, far longer than Marty expected. When the platform finally stopped, the gate slid open to reveal a wide hallway lined with gray concrete walls and overhead fluorescent lights. The air was warmer down here, but the chill of the unknown still lingered in Marty's chest. The group was led down the hallway by one of the officers. They passed door after door, each marked only with a number. No labels, no names, no indication of what lay beyond them. The silence was unsettling. Finally, they arrived at a massive steel door at least 15 feet high and a foot thick. The officer picked up a red telephone mounted on the wall and said something Marty couldn't hear. Slowly, with the grinding sound of metal on metal, the door began to open. Marty's breath caught in his throat. He expected to see a missile silo or some advanced military weapon. But what lay beyond the door was something much stranger. They stepped into a cavernous chamber, and Marty's eyes widened. In the center of the room stood a massive black pyramid, its surface smooth and polished like obsidian. The edges of the pyramid were sharp and precise, angling upward at a steeper pitch than the pyramids of Egypt. Overhead lights reflected off its surface, giving it an eerie glow. Marty's engineering mind immediately kicked into overdrive. The angles weren't right for a traditional structure. They were sharper, measuring approximately 48 degrees instead of 45. That was significant, but he couldn't quite figure out why. The officer's voice echoed through the chamber. "Welcome to the Dark Pyramid." Marty was floored. He had read about pyramids before. Of course, Egypt, Mexico, but this was nothing like those. For one thing, it was underground. For another, it wasn't made of stone. It seemed metallic, almost like a conductor. Marty walked closer, examining the edges and the surface. There were no seams, no cracks. It was as if the pyramid had been crafted from a single piece of material, something not from this earth. Over the next few months, Marty and the other engineers worked around the clock, trying to understand the pyramid's purpose. It was wired with a network of cables and machinery, with control rooms located at each corner. Instruments inside the control rooms measured massive amounts of energy flowing through the structure. Marty and his team quickly realized this was not a monument, it was a machine. When they tested it, the results were astounding. The pyramid could generate enormous amounts of energy, far more than any known power plant. Marty built a smaller scale replica using aluminum and ran a low-voltage current through it. The replica amplified the energy output beyond all reasonable expectations, enough to power his entire house and farm back home in Nebraska. The full-scale pyramid, Marty estimated, could generate enough power to supply the entire country. Marty worked on the project for nearly a year before his clearance was suddenly revoked. He was flown back to Nebraska without explanation, told to forget everything he had seen. But Marty wasn't the type to forget. He built several replicas of the pyramid over the years, each time refining the design, each time confirming that the original structure was something far beyond human engineering. Years later, Marty confided in his son about the project. He believed the pyramid was not built by humans, at least not by any civilization we know of. He suspected it was ancient, possibly tens of thousands of years old. And yet, it still worked. Marty was convinced that the pyramid wasn't just a source of power, it was part of a larger network. A network that stretched across the globe, connecting pyramids in Egypt, Mexico, Indonesia, and Alaska. Lee Pearson's story, though different, reinforced Marty's suspicions. In the spring of 1978, Lee, a retired military pilot, was invited on a helicopter run through the Alaskan Triangle. As they approached the Denali area, Lee's pilot warned him that the instruments would start malfunctioning, and they did. The compass spun wildly, the radar shut down, and the communication systems went dead. And yet, the helicopter kept flying. When they landed, Lee saw military guards, blacked-out vehicles, and armed personnel with no insignia. They unloaded crates quickly and efficiently, then sent the helicopter back into the sky. When Lee asked his pilot what was happening, the pilot just tapped his headset and whispered, "They're listening." Years later, Lee and Marty's stories would intersect with Doug Muchler's discovery of the unsurveyed section of Denali National Park. The pyramid, Marty believed, was still there, operational, hidden, and under military control. What it was powering and why remains a mystery. The Dark Pyramid, a secret power source hidden beneath Alaska. It was a crisp spring morning in 1959 when Marty Johnson boarded a military transport plane bound for Alaska. Marty was no stranger to secrecy. As an electrical engineer working for Bell Labs, a subsidiary of Western Electric, and partly owned by AT&T, he had spent the last decade working on highly classified military projects. He had helped develop early transistors, those tiny devices that would go on to revolutionize the world of electronics. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to encounter beneath the frozen ground of Alaska. Marty had received his orders a week earlier. A no-nonsense military officer had handed him a sealed envelope and said, "Pack for cold weather. You're heading to Alaska. Further instructions will follow." That was it. No details, no explanation. But Marty didn't ask questions. He had learned long ago that in this line of work, the less you knew, the safer you were. After landing at a remote airstrip near Unalakleet, Alaska, Marty and a small group of engineers and technicians were ushered onto a white bus with blacked-out windows. The bus rumbled to life and began a long journey into the Alaskan wilderness. The windows were completely covered, so Marty couldn't see where they were going, but he could feel the twists and turns of the road beneath them. Occasionally, the bus would stop, and he could hear muffled conversations between the driver and someone outside. After about 6 hours, the bus came to a stop when the doors opened. The cold hit Marty like a slap in the face. The air was crisp and biting, cutting through his military-issued parka. Squinting in the blinding white light reflecting off the snow, he saw two men in uniform standing next to what looked like a concrete shed. The surrounding area was completely barren, just snow, ice, and distant mountains. It was hard to believe that anything of importance could be hidden out here. The group was herded into the shed, where one of the officers barked, grabbed the handrail, and hold on. Marty felt a jolt beneath his feet as the platform beneath them began to descend. It was an elevator, an enormous one. It descended for what felt like an eternity. As they descended, the air grew warmer, and Marty noticed that the walls of the elevator shaft were lined with smooth, dark stone. This wasn't just a military installation, it was something older, something ancient. When the elevator finally stopped, the group stepped out into a long concrete hallway. The walls were painted a dull beige, and the air smelled faintly metallic. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed quietly. It looked like any other military facility Marty had seen except for one thing. The doors along the hallway had no markings, no labels, no insignias, just numbers. The officers led the group down the hallway and stopped in front of a massive steel door at least 15 feet high and nearly a foot thick. One of the officers picked up a red telephone receiver on the wall and said something that Marty couldn't hear. With a low groan of metal on metal, the door began to slide open. Marty felt his pulse quicken as the enormous door revealed what lay beyond. Inside was a vast cavern illuminated by overhead lights. And in the center of the cavern was a structure unlike anything Marty had ever seen, a massive black pyramid. Its surface was smooth and polished, reflecting the dim light like obsidian. It stood over 500 feet tall, with a base nearly 700 feet wide. The pyramid's angles were slightly off 48 degrees instead of the traditional 45 degrees found in most pyramids. An officer stepped forward and addressed the group. "Welcome to the Dark Pyramid. This facility is now under military control. What you see here is classified at the highest level. You're not to speak of this project outside of this facility. Violating this order will be treated as treason. Marty could feel the tension in the room as the engineers exchanged nervous glances. The officer continued, "Your job here is to assist with the energy distribution project. We believe this pyramid is not just a structure, it's a power source. Your task is to figure out how it works. Over the next several weeks, Marty and the other engineers were given access to different parts of the pyramid. They found control rooms at each corner of the base, filled with strange equipment. Marty worked with a team tasked with analyzing the energy flow within the pyramid. What they discovered defied explanation. The pyramid was generating energy, massive amounts of it. The energy wasn't coming from a power source they could identify. There were no reactors, no fuel cells. The energy seemed to be coming from the structure itself. Marty suspected that the pyramid was somehow tapping into the Earth's natural electromagnetic field. One day, while working in one of the control rooms, Marty had an idea. He requested a small amount of aluminum and built a scale model of the pyramid just a few feet high. He connected it to a low-voltage power source and ran a small current through it. To his astonishment, the output was far greater than the input. The small pyramid seemed to be amplifying the energy. Marty took the model home after his work at the facility was finished and used it to power his entire house and farm. Marty's superiors were aware of his discovery, but they didn't seem particularly surprised. "Good work, Johnson," one of the officers said. "But don't talk about this outside the facility." Marty nodded, but deep down, he knew that what he had discovered was groundbreaking. Years later, Marty confided in his son about what he had experienced. That pyramid was alive, he told him. It was ancient, older than anything we know. It wasn't built by humans, not modern ones anyway. Marty believed the pyramid was part of a global energy grid, connecting pyramids in Egypt, Indonesia, and other locations around the world. He even speculated that the pyramid might be connected to extraterrestrial activity. "It's not just generating energy," he told his son. "It's communicating with something out there." Marty never learned exactly who or what was controlling the pyramid. He retired a few years after his assignment in Alaska and took his secrets to the grave. But his son, inspired by his father's story, began his own search for the truth. The Dark Pyramid, if it truly exists, could be the key to understanding not only Earth's ancient past, but also its future. Marty's story is one of many surrounding the mysterious Dark Pyramid of Alaska. Some believe it's a myth, while others are convinced that it's a closely guarded government secret. But one thing is certain: if the pyramid is real, it holds the potential to change everything we know about energy, history, and our place in the universe. The Men in Black and the Dark Pyramid of Alaska. Doug Muchler had always been a man of discipline and order. His time as a counterintelligence officer taught him that every action had a purpose. Every event had a meaning, even if that meaning wasn't immediately clear. But nothing in his years of service could have prepared him for what he encountered in the archives of Fort Meade, Maryland, in the early 1990s. Doug wasn't the type to chase conspiracy theories or believe in far-fetched stories, but this wasn't some wild tale. This was real. And the consequences of digging too deep were becoming dangerously clear. It all started with that strange news broadcast in late 1992, the one about the underground nuclear test in China that revealed a massive pyramid buried beneath the Alaskan tundra. Doug saw it with his own eyes, along with nearly 40 other soldiers. But by the next day, the story was gone, completely erased. No mention of it in any follow-up reports, and the local news station denied it ever aired. Doug wasn't the only one who remembered it, but the fear in the station manager's eyes made it clear that someone had made sure the story disappeared permanently. When Doug was transferred to Fort Meade in 1993, he knew this was his chance to get answers. Fort Meade was home to one of the largest government archives in the country, rows upon rows of files, carefully categorized and heavily guarded. If the military knew something about the pyramid, the answer would be in those files. Doug played it smart. He didn't ask about the pyramid directly. That would have raised too many red flags. Instead, he casually asked the archivist for any information on archaeological sites in Alaska. The archivist barely looked up as he scribbled down a list of numbers and handed Doug a slip of paper. The note gave him the location of the Alaska files. Doug's heart pounded as he walked down the long, cold hallway lined with metal shelves. He followed the instructions and soon found himself sitting in a small reading room with a stack of manila folders in front of him. As he opened the first file, he could feel the weight of history in his hands. Maps, geological surveys, declassified military reports, all of it pointed to some kind of structure deep beneath the Alaskan wilderness. It was there, right where the news report had said it would be. His breath quickened as he flipped through the pages. Then he felt a presence behind him. Two men in dark suits stood over him. They weren't wearing military uniforms, but there was no mistaking their authority. They had that quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing they had the power to make problems and people disappear. "You don't have a need to know," one of the men said, his voice low and steady. Doug turned to face them, trying to keep his composure. "I'm just looking into archaeological sites," he replied, knowing full well that they weren't buying it. "We know what you're looking for," the other man said, stepping closer. His eyes were dark and cold. "You need to leave the building immediately." Doug stood his ground. "Why?" The man leaned in, his expression unchanging. "Because they don't want us messing with them anymore." Doug's mind raced. They? He opened his mouth to ask who they were talking about, but the men were already turning away. "Wait," Doug called after them. "Who doesn't want us messing with them?" But the men were gone. Doug stood in the silent reading room, the manila folders still spread out before him. He looked down at the pages and realized his hands were shaking. He had seen the data with his own eyes. He knew the pyramid was real, but the implication of what the man had said chilled him to his core. Whoever they were, weren't just protecting the pyramid's existence. They were actively operating it. The military knew exactly what was down there, and they were using it, or worse, they were under the control of whatever was beneath the ice. Doug returned to his quarters that night, replaying the encounter in his mind. His training taught him to follow orders, to stay within the boundaries of his security clearance. But this was different. This wasn't about national security. It was about something bigger, something older, and something far more dangerous. He confided in a few trusted colleagues about what he had seen and heard. Some brushed him off as paranoid, but others admitted they had heard whispers about strange energy readings coming from deep beneath Alaska. High-ranking officers had been seen flying into Anchorage under cover of darkness. Unmarked military transports were spotted near Denali. It all pointed to something big and carefully hidden. Doug knew that if he pushed any further, he might disappear like the news report had. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the military's secrecy wasn't about keeping the information from the public. It was about keeping whatever was in that pyramid contained. Years later, Doug would finally go public with his story. He contacted investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe, providing her with his full-service record and details about the men in black. Linda had seen similar patterns before, high-ranking military officers with first-hand knowledge of alien encounters and advanced technology. Doug wasn't the first whistleblower to come forward, but his story carried weight. The men in black were real. The pyramid was real. And the military knew exactly what they were protecting or what they were afraid of. Doug's story spread through the UFO and conspiracy theory communities, sparking intense debate. Skeptics dismissed it as a misremembered story or an exaggerated account. But those who had been around long enough knew better. The patterns were too consistent, the details too specific. The government had covered up UFO sightings before. Why not an ancient alien power source buried in Alaska? Doug never stopped searching for answers. But the message from those men in black was clear. Some things are meant to stay hidden. And whoever or whatever built that pyramid had no intention of letting humanity take control. The mystery of the Dark Pyramid, an ancient energy source hidden beneath Alaska. Hidden beneath the rugged terrain of Alaska, deep in the frozen wilderness, lies a secret that could challenge everything we think we know about human history and the limits of technology. This secret is not just another tall tale spun around a campfire. It's a story backed by eyewitnesses, strange government behavior, and a growing body of circumstantial evidence. At the heart of this mystery is the so-called Dark Pyramid, an enormous underground structure made of black stone, believed to be thousands of years old and capable of generating massive amounts of energy. What makes this story even more compelling is the growing belief that this pyramid, along with others scattered around the globe, might not have been built by human hands at all. The theory that the Dark Pyramid is part of an ancient global energy grid is not as far-fetched as it may seem at first glance. Throughout history, pyramids have fascinated scientists and historians alike. From the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt to the mysterious stone structures of Indonesia and South America, pyramids have appeared across vastly different cultures and time periods. Yet, they share similar architectural features: precise alignments with celestial bodies, complex internal chambers, and construction techniques that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. How could ancient civilizations, separated by oceans and thousands of years, have created such similar and advanced structures? Proponents of the ancient energy grid theory believe that these pyramids were not just tombs or religious monuments, but sophisticated energy conductors designed to harness and transmit power across great distances. This idea suggests that pyramids were built from materials specifically chosen for their conductive properties like limestone, granite, and quartz. These materials are known to have piezoelectric properties, meaning they can generate electrical charges under pressure. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, contains a significant amount of quartz crystal and limestone, both of which are capable of producing electric fields. The idea is that these pyramids pulled energy from the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, which some researchers call the zero-point field, and distributed it wirelessly, similar to how Nikola Tesla once envisioned wireless power transmission. The Dark Pyramid in Alaska fits perfectly into this theory. Witnesses who claim to have seen it describe it as being larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, with sharply defined edges and an imposing black surface. Marty Johnson, a former electrical engineer who worked on classified military projects, claimed that the Dark Pyramid was a working power generator, one that produced a staggering amount of energy. According to Johnson, the pyramid's internal structure was designed to amplify and store this energy, which could then be released in controlled bursts. He even went so far as to say that a small replica he built using aluminum and quartz was able to produce enough power to run his entire household and farm. What makes the Alaskan Dark Pyramid even more intriguing is its possible connection to other pyramids around the world. Some researchers believe that the pyramids in Alaska, Egypt, Indonesia, and Central America form part of a massive global grid designed to transfer and amplify energy. This grid may have been used to power ancient cities or even advanced technology that has since been lost to history. The idea that ancient civilizations might have been more technologically advanced than we assume is not new, but the concept that they could have mastered wireless energy transmission on a global scale is groundbreaking. Then there's the UFO connection. Alaska has long been a hotbed for unexplained aerial phenomena. Over 6,500 UFO sightings have been reported in the Alaska Triangle, a vast area stretching from Anchorage to Juneau and over to Barrow. Some believe that these UFOs are drawn to the energy emitted by the Dark Pyramid. More disturbingly, remote viewers, psychics trained in seeing distant objects and events, have described the Dark Pyramid as an alien power station. According to one such viewer, the pyramid functions as a charging station for extraterrestrial craft. She claimed to have seen a network of underground tunnels connecting the pyramid to a military facility where human and non-human entities were working side by side. If the Dark Pyramid truly exists, and if it is generating energy on such a massive scale, the question becomes, who built it? Supporters of the ancient alien theory argue that the pyramid was constructed or at least designed by an advanced extraterrestrial race. The precision of the angles 48 degrees rather than the standard 45 degrees, the material composition, and the sheer size of the structure suggest a level of engineering sophistication that ancient human civilizations would have struggled to achieve. If true, this would mean that ancient humans may have had contact with extraterrestrial beings who shared technological knowledge, or perhaps even built these structures for them. Of course, the US government's involvement adds another layer of intrigue. Why would the military be so intent on keeping this discovery secret? Some speculate that the pyramid's energy potential could be weaponized, which would explain the intense secrecy surrounding it. Others believe that revealing the truth about the Dark Pyramid would force governments to admit that they have long known about extraterrestrial contact, a revelation that could fundamentally alter religious, political, and scientific institutions worldwide. Skeptics argue that the story of the Dark Pyramid is little more than a blend of misinterpreted geological data, faulty memories, and wishful thinking. After all, no satellite imagery or official geological surveys have confirmed the existence of the pyramid. But the growing number of credible witnesses, including military personnel and engineers, suggests that there is at least some truth behind the story, v. The fact that the government has gone to such great lengths to cover it up only adds to the suspicion that they are hiding something far more significant than a simple underground rock formation. The idea that ancient pyramids, including the Dark Pyramid, form a global power grid raises profound questions about human history and the true capabilities of ancient civilizations. Did ancient humans possess advanced scientific knowledge that was lost over time? Were they aided by extraterrestrial visitors who shared their technology? And if the Dark Pyramid in Alaska is indeed still functional, could it hold the key to unlocking a new era of clean, limitless energy? The truth may be buried beneath the ice and stone of Alaska, but the questions it raises stretch far beyond the frozen wilderness. If the Dark Pyramid is real, and if it's truly part of an ancient energy grid, then it's not just a historical artifact. It's a technological legacy left behind by a civilization far more advanced than we ever imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's a key to understanding not just our past, but also our future. The mystery of the Dark Pyramid, a tale of truth or fabrication. Doug Muchler was not the kind of man to make things up. He was a seasoned military intelligence officer with decades of experience working in counter-espionage and classified operations. When he first came forward with his story about the Dark Pyramid beneath the Alaskan wilderness, many people were quick to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. But Doug wasn't just any whistleblower. He had the credentials, the knowledge, and the details that made his story hard to ignore. And yet, as compelling as his account was, it left more questions than answers. Doug first spoke about the pyramid in the early 2010s, almost 20 years after he had initially stumbled upon the story. According to Doug, in late November or early December of 1992, he and nearly 40 other soldiers were watching the evening news when a story broke about a powerful underground nuclear test conducted by China. The seismic waves from the blast were so intense that they reached Alaska. But the shocking part wasn't the nuclear test, it was the discovery of a massive pyramid-shaped structure beneath the Alaskan soil. The news anchor reported that the structure was larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing over 550 feet tall and buried nearly 700 feet underground. Doug was certain that the location of the pyramid matched the same and surveyed area he had spotted on the military maps years earlier while stationed at Fort Richardson. Doug immediately recognized the significance of the story and decided to record the late-night news to capture any follow-ups. But when the 11 o'clock broadcast came, there was no mention of the pyramid. Confused, Doug contacted some of his fellow soldiers who had also seen the earlier broadcast. They all confirmed that they had seen the same story. Determined to figure out what had happened, Doug went to the local news station the next day. That's when things started to get strange. The station manager claimed to have no knowledge of the story. He insisted that no such broadcast had ever aired. Doug pushed, but the manager stood firm. Frustrated, Doug was about to leave when a young staffer approached him nervously. The man lowered his voice and told Doug that the story was real. They had aired it during the 6 o'clock broadcast. But shortly after, 2 men in dark suits had shown up at the station. They spoke with the manager behind closed doors for nearly an hour. After they left, the order was given to erase the tapes, pull the story, and act as though it had never happened. The staffer said he was warned not to speak about it again under threat of losing his job or worse. Doug knew the tactics well. As a military intelligence officer, he had seen this kind of pressure applied before. The idea that government agents would swoop in to cover up a story was not surprising to him, but the fact that it was over a pyramid buried beneath Alaska. That raised even more questions. Doug's story became even more puzzling when he transferred to Fort Meade, Maryland, the headquarters of the National Security Agency, NSA, in 1993. While working near the facility's massive archive, a multi-floor warehouse filled with classified government files, Doug decided to dig deeper. He approached the archivist and asked for any files related to archaeological sites in Alaska. He didn't mention the pyramid specifically, knowing that secrecy would be his best chance at getting information. The archivist handed him a slip of paper with the floor, row, and shelf number where the Alaska files were stored. Doug found the section easily and pulled out a few folders. He settled into a reading room and began sifting through the documents. But just as he started making sense of the material, 2 men entered the room. Doug described them as goons, large men in dark suits with blank expressions. They stood behind him and said, "You don't have a need to know that information." Doug, trying to keep his composure, responded calmly, "I'm just looking at archaeological sites in Alaska." The men didn't budge. "We know what you're looking for. You need to leave the building." Now Doug hesitated, but the men's tone left no room for negotiation. As he left the reading room, one of the men added, "They don't want us messing with them up there anymore." "Messing with who?" Doug asked. The man didn't answer. Doug left the building feeling shaken. He had been in intelligence long enough to know that whoever they were, it wasn't just the U.S. government. The implied threat was clear. Whatever was buried beneath Alaska was important enough for someone or something to keep it hidden. Doug remained quiet about the incident for years, but the memory of the dark pyramid haunted him. After leaving the service, he decided to go public with his story. He reached out to Linda Moulton Howe, an Emmy-winning investigative journalist known for her work on UFOs and government cover-ups. Doug provided Linda with his military records, including his DD-214 form, a document that verified his service history, rank, and assignments. Linda vetted the information and confirmed that Doug was exactly who he claimed to be. But Doug's story wasn't without inconsistencies. For one, there was no record of a Chinese nuclear test in late 1992. The closest confirmed event was a Chinese underground test in May 1992, 6 months earlier than Doug remembered. Human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially after decades, so it's possible Doug misremembered the timeline. He also claimed that the Chinese had notified the United Nations about the test, but no such notification exists in any public record. Skeptics were quick to point out these discrepancies, but Doug's supporters argued that memory lapses after 20 years were understandable. And Doug wasn't the only one making these claims. Other military and civilian witnesses had come forward with similar stories about a pyramid and strange electromagnetic activity in the area. So, is there really a massive pyramid buried beneath Alaska? Doug Muchler's story is compelling, but it's not airtight. While the lack of concrete evidence makes it easy to dismiss the story as a myth or exaggeration, the sheer consistency of the accounts raises intriguing questions. Could Doug and others have stumbled upon evidence of an ancient power source, or were they manipulated by the very intelligence agencies they once served? Doug himself admits that he may never know the full truth. But if there really is a dark pyramid beneath the Alaskan wilderness, one thing is certain: someone, somewhere, wants to keep it buried. The mystery of the Dark Pyramid, a journey into the unknown. Bruce Pearson sat by the small window of the Cessna, the hum of the engine steady beneath him as the Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly below. Snow-capped peaks and dense evergreen forests filled the horizon, interrupted only by the occasional frozen river or rocky outcrop. His father, Lee Pearson, had told him stories about this place when he was young, stories about the strange flight into Denali back in 1978, when the helicopter's instruments failed, and men in black uniforms with no insignia greeted them at a mysterious landing zone. His father's words had stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind like a half-forgotten dream. But Bruce was no longer a boy. He was here now, in the flesh, searching for the truth his father had hinted at so many years ago. As the pilot banked the plane to the left, Bruce adjusted his headset and squinted down at the landscape. They had been flying for nearly 2 hours due east from Unalakleet. His father had always been specific about the location east of Unalakleet and west of Mount Denali. Most people had written off his father's story as the ramblings of an old soldier chasing ghosts. But Bruce knew better. His father had been a no-nonsense kind of man, grounded and logical. If Lee Pearson said he saw something, Bruce believed him, coming up on the coordinates. The pilot called out over the headset. Bruce leaned forward, his heart pounding. Through the thin veil of clouds below, he saw it, a patch of land that didn't look right. Amid the natural curves of the hills and valleys was something unnatural, a squared-off section of land, too symmetrical to be the work of nature. Circle back, Bruce said. The pilot made a wide loop, bringing the Cessna around for another pass. Bruce pulled out his camera and started snapping photos. His breath caught when he spotted a narrow dirt road cutting through the dense forest, leading toward the squared-off patch of land. It wasn't marked on any map. There were no signs of recent human activity, but the road was too well defined to be abandoned for long. There, Bruce shouted. The pilot nodded and dipped the plane lower. Bruce's eyes widened as he saw the remnants of an airstrip. The clearing was overgrown, but the outline of the tarmac was still visible beneath the snow and ice. His father had mentioned the airstrip, the one guarded by men with no insignia and a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a jeep. The fact that the airstrip was real made Bruce's pulse quicken. They made one more pass before the pilot pulled up and began climbing to a higher altitude. Bruce stared out the window, his mind racing. His father's stories were true, at least part of them. If the road and airstrip were real, what else could be true? Was there really a massive pyramid beneath the ground? A pyramid that could generate enough power to fuel the entire country? And if so, why had it been kept secret for so long? Back on the ground, Bruce rented a snowmobile and packed enough supplies to last him several days. He was determined to see this through. The trail to the airstrip wasn't easy. Thick snow and ice made the going rough, but Bruce pressed on. His father's memory drove him forward. Lee had passed away years ago, but Bruce could still hear his voice in his head, encouraging him, pushing him to seek the truth. After 2 days of navigating the harsh Alaskan terrain, Bruce finally reached the site. The airstrip was more intact than he had expected. The snow had settled unevenly, revealing the cracked surface of the tarmac beneath. Bruce walked slowly, his boots crunching through the ice. He spotted the remains of an old guard shack near the edge of the clearing. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the walls were weathered by decades of harsh winters. Bruce approached cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. Inside the shack, the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted metal, and what looked like the remnants of communication equipment. He knelt down and brushed away the snow and ice. Underneath, he found a metal plate bolted to the floor. He pulled out his pocket knife and began working the bolts loose. After several minutes, the plate lifted away with a metallic groan. Beneath the plate was a dark shaft descending into the ground. Cold air rushed upward, carrying a faint metallic scent. Bruce shined his flashlight down the hole, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. His heart hammered in his chest. He thought about his father's story about the underground elevator, the massive steel door, and the cavernous room beyond. Taking a deep breath, Bruce sat down beside the hole and pulled out his satellite phone. He stared at it for a long time, considering his next move. He could call for help, report his findings to someone who could investigate further. But then he thought about the men in black, the ones who had visited the news station after his father saw the broadcast about the pyramid. If Bruce told the wrong person, this place might disappear overnight, just like the news story, just like his father's testimony. Bruce slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood up. He had come too far to turn back now. He pulled a length of rope from his pack, secured it to a nearby metal post, and tied it tightly around his waist. Then, with one last deep breath, he lowered himself into the darkness. The descent was slow. The walls of the shaft were lined with smooth metal panels, too precise to be natural. Bruce's flashlight flickered slightly as he went deeper. His feet finally touched solid ground, and he turned to find himself in a long, narrow hallway. The air was warmer here. A low humming sound vibrated through the walls. Bruce followed the sound. After several minutes of walking, he reached a large steel door, nearly identical to the one his father had described. His hand trembled as he reached out and touched the surface. The metal was warm beneath his fingers. Without warning, the door slid open with a deep mechanical groan. Bruce stepped inside and froze. The room beyond was massive, a vast cavern lit by soft, bluish light. In the center of the cavern was a massive black structure. The angles of the walls were steep and sharp, sloping inward to form a perfect pyramid. The surface of the pyramid was smooth and reflective, almost like obsidian. Bruce's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. His father had been right. The dark pyramid was real. Bruce took a cautious step forward. Lights flickered across the surface of the pyramid, pulsing rhythmically. He felt a low vibration beneath his feet. Somewhere deep within the structure, something was alive, something ancient. A noise behind him made Bruce turn. A figure stood at the entrance to the room, silhouetted against the light. Tall, slender, and distinctly not human. The figure's eyes glowed faintly. It raised one long hand and gestured toward the pyramid. Bruce took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to run, but some deep part of him knew that there was no turning back now. He had stepped into the unknown, and the unknown had welcomed him. Bruce swallowed hard, steadied his breath, and stepped toward the pyramid.